For 100 years, the High Lords of the North sacrificed their finest daughters to the shadows of the Black Keep. They hoped to shatter the curse of the slumbering Wolf King. Not one girl ever returned. Crimson turned to black crust on the obsidian altar. Hope rotted into a lethal tax paid in human souls. In the frozen winter of 1244, the Alpha of the Ironwood Pack broke the cycle. He did not send his pampered heir, he sent a scapegoat, a packless runt named Odette. She was intended as collateral damage for a sleeping monster. The lords believed they were discarding trash. They did not know they were handing the true king his crown. The winter of 1244 was a killer. 6 feet of snow buried the Ironwood Pack. A suffocating dread hung in the air. The centennial tribute was due. Inside the Ironwood estate, Alpha Gideon Vane paced the great hall. His heavy fur cloak dragged against the cold stone. Ancient law was absolute. The Alpha of the strongest pack had to provide a royal maiden for the Ethelgard keep. This was a blood tithe. It was meant to appease King Elaric of House Valyrius. He was the Lycan monarch locked in a cursed sleep for exactly 100 years. Legends whispered that only royal blood could wake him. But after a century of silence, the ritual was just an execution sentence. In the corner, Cecilia wept. The Alpha's daughter clutched her velvet skirts in terror. She refused to go. She called the keep a graveyard. She called the king a monster who drank the blood of girls. Gideon snapped at her, his eyes darting toward the oak doors. He would not send his treasure. He turned to Kaelin, his scarred lead huntsman. He ordered the brute to fetch the Omega. In the damp belly of the keep, Odette worked. She scrubbed iron cauldrons until her hands bled from the lye. Odette was an anomaly. In a world of shifting wolves and raw power, she was packless. She had no wolf spirit, no shift, no family. They found her 20 years ago as a toddler. She had a strange crescent scar on her collarbone. She was kept only to serve as the lowest slave. She was a null, a wolf without a wolf. Kaelin's heavy boots rang out on the stone. Odette did not look up. Then a massive hand gripped her hair and yanked her back. He smelled of stale ale and old tobacco. He told her the Alpha required her, but for a null, there was nowhere to run. She was dragged into the grand hall. Odette fell before the fire. The sudden heat bit into her frozen feet. She kept her eyes on the floor. It was a habit of survival learned through decades of abuse. Cecilia sneered from the shadows. She called Odette a creature of grease and dirt. She claimed the keep's magic would see the lie. The maesters would know the tribute was a fake. But Gideon stepped forward. He towered over the girl on the floor. He said the maesters only required a maiden bearing the scent of ironwood. Odette had lived there for 20 years. She smelled of their pines and their smoke. They would dress her in silk. They would hide her shame under the ironwood crest. The iron gates of Ethelgard do not care if a soul is packless. Once they seal, status is irrelevant. The debt will be settled, and the curse will finally have its meat. Inside her chest, Odette felt her heart hammer, a panicked bird striking the bars of its cage. Every child in the north knew the nursery rhyme. King Alaric rests on a bed of stone, waiting for a bride he can strip to the bone. __quote _0__, Odette said. Her voice remained steady. It was a raspy alto that cut through the hiss of the hearth. She looked up, her violet eyes an unnatural shade that had always unnerved the pack, locking onto Gideon Vane. __quote _1__. Gideon did not argue. He roared. The Alpha's backhand caught her across the face with sickening force. Odette hit the floor, a fresh gash opening over her cheekbone. __2_, Gideon hissed. Quote 3, quote, They stripped away her rags. They forced her into a heavy gown of midnight blue velvet, fabric that felt stiff and reeking of mothballs. At her throat they fastened the silver direwolf clasp of the ironwood pack. Through the humiliation, Odette remained silent. In the brutal hierarchy of the Lycan territories, a packless wolf possessed fewer rights than a common hound. At the stroke of midnight, Kalin shoved her into a reinforced iron carriage. There was no procession, no honors. Only a weary driver, a scarred huntsman, and a terrified scapegoat moving toward the Deadlands. As the carriage lurched forward, Odette wiped the blood from her face. She was leaving the only hell she had ever known. She was heading toward a frozen, cursed end. Yet, as the Ironwood estate vanished into the blizzard, a dark thought brought her comfort. At least she would dive far away from them. The journey north lasted 3 grueling weeks. The landscape bled of life, shifting from snowy pines into the jagged desolation of the wasting moor. Here the curse felt like a physical weight. The trees were petrified monuments of agony, their branches clawing at a sunless grey sky. On the 21st day, the black keep of Ethelgard emerged from the fog. It was a colossus carved into the mountain's heart. Its spires pierced the heavy clouds like obsidian needles. It did not look like a fortress for the living. It looked like a tomb for a god. Kalin brought the carriage to a halt at the edge of the drawbridge. Odette watched, breathless, as the massive iron doors ground open. The bridge lowered on rusted ancient chains, spanning a chasm of infinite blackness. Kalin grunted. He refused to look at the spires. Even the hardened huntsman was shaking. The wolf beneath his skin was whimpering, terrified of the ancient apex predator sleeping within the stone. Odette stepped into the biting wind. The velvet offered no protection against the supernatural chill. Kalin commanded, his hand white-knuckled on his silver-hilted dagger. __quote _7_ Odette did not give him the satisfaction of a glance. She gathered the heavy blue skirts and began to walk. The wooden planks groaned under her weight. Below, the wind rose from the abyss, whispering in voices that sounded like the weeping of the dead. She reached the iron gates of the keep, bracing for a struggle. Instead, she found a pulse. As her bare palm met the freezing metal, a deep, resonating hum thrummed through the iron. The doors had been sealed for 10 years. Now they groaned open with a shriek that echoed through the valley. Behind her the world moved fast. Kalin lashed the horses. The carriage fled south as if pursued by ghosts. Odette stood alone. The foyer of Ethelgard was a cavern of eternal winter. Black marble pillars rose into the dark like frozen giants. But the hall was not empty. As her eyes adjusted, Odette felt her heart stop. Statues stood scattered across the floor. She stepped toward a woman in decaying emerald silk. The face was not carved. It was gripped by a scream of absolute terror. Odette recognized the crest on the tarnished necklace. This was Lady Beatrice of the Riverrun pack. This was a tribute from 30 years ago. She backed away, stumbling into another figure. A man in the armor of the Westfold pack. The curse had not claimed their lives. It had stolen their time. They were living monuments of ice, bound to guard a master who would not wake. The sheer sorcery required for this was staggering. They failed. The wind seemed to whisper the words through the hollow stone. Odette shook with a cold that bit into her marrow. She needed fire. She pushed deeper into the keep, past rotting feasts and rusted blades. The air grew heavy, pulling her toward the apex of the fortress. She climbed the grand staircase until her legs burned. At the top, silver doors depicted a wolf beneath a blood-red moon. Odette took a breath and pushed. The throne room was a circle of moonlight. A single beam from the ceiling illuminated the center of the hall. There sat the throne of Ethelgard. It was a jagged throne of swords and obsidian, but Odette only saw the man, King Alaric of House Valerius. Even seated, he was a Titan. He wore rusted armor and furs that defied the ages. His head was bowed, resting on a steel gauntlet. He looked less like a king and more like a feral god of war. Magic had chained him. Black thorny ivy coiled around his chest and legs, anchoring him to the obsidian seat. He was magnificent. He was terrifying. Odette took a single trembling step. Survival dictated she find a dark corner to freeze in silence. Yet a rhythmic thrumming in her chest pulled her forward. It matched the agonizingly slow pulse of the king's heart. Thump, thump. She climbed the dais, the air so frigid it felt like inhaling broken glass. Her boot snagged a thorny vine. She stumbled, her weight falling against the obsidian throne. The jagged black stone sliced deep into her palm. Odette hissed, recoiling as a single drop of crimson fell. It landed on the frozen ivy binding the king's chest. For one heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the blood sizzled. The sound was violent, like water hitting a white-hot iron skillet. Where the blood touched the black plant, the ivy shriveled into white ash. Below the armor, that sluggish heartbeat suddenly surged. Odette scrambled back, clutching her wounded hand. Crack! The sound detonated in the throne room like a flintlock pistol. Odette froze. Across the dark armor of Alaric, the frost began to splinter. Spiderweb fractures raced through the ice. The distant thumping of his heart became a frantic, deafening roar. Thump, 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 thump. The vibration rattled the stone floor and Odette's very bones. Panic flooded her veins. Gideon Vane had been wrong. The maesters were fools. The blood of a packless runt was not an insult to the curse. It was a catalyst. The thick, thorny vines that had anchored the monarch for a century began to writhe. They hissed like dying serpents, retreating into the stone floor in sheer terror. The ice encasing him didn't melt. It exploded. A cloud of glittering diamond dust filled the air. Odette fell hard onto the stone, tripping over her heavy velvet skirts. On the throne, King Alaric's gauntlet groaned. His fingers twitched. Slowly, with the weight of an era, the king lifted his head. Odette stopped breathing. His eyes snapped open. They were not the eyes of a man. They were the glowing, molten gold of an apex predator. He drew his first breath in 100 years. It was a ragged, rattling inhale, the sound of a hurricane tearing through a canyon. He sat up, his massive frame dwarfing the obsidian throne. He did not look disoriented. He looked lethal. He looked starved. Alaric rose. The heavy furs on his shoulders settled with a dull thud. He stood at his full towering height, a monstrous shadow stretching across the room. He rolled his broad shoulders, his ancient joints popping in the silence. Then his golden gaze locked onto Odette. The king stepped from the dais. One armored boot hit the stone, then the other. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, stalking toward her. Odette pushed herself backward, her skin scraping the freezing floor. __quote _8__, she managed to choke out, her voice failing her. Death was a certainty. Alaric loomed over her, a living nursery rhyme turned into a nightmare of flesh and steel. He halted inches from her face. A jagged, silvered scar traced his jawline, disappearing into the throat of his armor. But this starving king did not see her as food. His golden eyes narrowed, predatory yet analytical. He did not draw a blade. Instead, he leaned in. His scent hit Odette like a physical weight. It was the smell of ancient earth, crushed pine, and the electric ozone of a gathering storm. He leaned against her neck, inhaling deeply. Odette squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for his fangs to find her jugular. Instead, a vibration started deep in the king's chest. It wasn't a snarl of rage. It was a low, possessive purr that rattled the air between them. Her blood began to burn. "You." Alaric's voice sounded like stones grinding together. It carried the weight of absolute command. "You do not carry the blood of the South." Odette shook her head in a panic. She was a packless runt, an Omega from Ironwood. Gideon had sent her here to die in his place. "I am nobody, my lord," she whispered. Alaric reached out. His massive, calloused palm cupped her jaw, tilting her face toward his. His skin wasn't cold like the stone walls. It was a furnace. A dark, jagged smile revealed his elongated fangs. The South had forgotten the truth of their own history. Agatha of the Moor had woven a curse of absolute stone. Only the blood of the true sovereign could shatter it. Odette stared at him, lost. Alaric's thumb traced the crescent-shaped scar on her collarbone. For years, Ironwood had mocked her for this mark. He murmured. The fire in his eyes burned with a new intensity. "Your wolf is not absent. She was merely hibernating, waiting for the king to wake." He stepped back and offered a hand large enough to crush her skull. Gideon thought he was sending a sacrifice to a monster. Instead, he had delivered a queen to her throne. She breathed. He tasted her name on his tongue, his smile turning predatory and sharp. This certainty shattered every reality she had known for 20 years. Trembling, she placed her small, bloodied hand into his. The blistering heat of his grip seared through the ice in her marrow. He pulled her to her feet. Suddenly, the keep groaned. The mountain itself began to shake as the black marble pillars shivered. The sound of cracking ice filled the air. __quote _17__. Alaric rumbled. The blood of House Crescentia has reclaimed the stone. Odette watched in silence as the frost on the walls began to melt away. Rainwater carved paths through a century of rot, peeling away the filth of a dead era. Below the massive archway, the frozen monuments of the tributes finally surrendered. Without the curse to anchor their agony, the magic simply dissolved. They did not shatter, they sighed. 10 decades of stone flesh softened into a mist of glittering snow, blanketing the cold cobblestones in the silence of mercy. The keep was finally granting them peace. But against the far wall of the throne room, the silence fractured. 3 monoliths of obsidian ice began to shudder. Then, the sound of 1,000 mirrors breaking. Shards of black glass sprayed the hall as 3 Lycan warriors slammed into the wet stone. They wore the same rusted ancient plate as their king. They gasped for air like men pulled from the bottom of an icy sea. The largest brute braced his iron-clad fists against the floor. His face was a map of old scars, his hair the color of forge-cooled steel. __quote _18___. Silas choked out, his voice a rasp of grinding stone. Alaric did not move. His voice carried effortlessly across the vast space. Silas staggered to his feet, his dark eyes locking onto Odette. He did not hesitate. He hammered a heavy fist against his heart in a fierce salute. __quote _21__. Odette recoiled, her shoulders striking the freezing edge of the obsidian throne. Hysteria bubbled in her throat. "Quote 22, she stammered, her voice thin and jagged. She looked at Alaric, pleading for sanity. Quote 23. Alaric moved into her space. He did not walk. He occupied the room, his massive frame swallowing the moonlight. He was not angry. He was something far more terrifying. Possessive. Quote 24 Alaric murmured. The gravel in his tone made the fine hairs on Odette's skin prickle. Quote 25 He spoke of a century-old betrayal, of the vain line kneeling to the witch Agatha to ambush his court. They had slaughtered House Crescentia, the ruling monarchs of the northern wastes. They were the only bloodline with the strength to chain Alaric's own feral nature. The usurpers thought the lineage was extinguished. They were wrong. His fingers, burning like hot coals, traced the crescent-shaped scar on her collarbone. The touch was electric. It sent a surge of predatory heat straight to her core. "This is no blade mark, Odette," he whispered. His golden eyes bled into a dark, molten amber as he leaned closer. His scent of ozone and pine wrapped around her like a heavy shroud. "This is the birthmark of the Crescentia matriarch. You cannot feel your wolf because the world was poison. A Crescentia wolf does not bend to a pathetic alpha. To survive, she went dormant. You lived among the very dogs who murdered your ancestors. Your wolf locked herself in a cage of silence to keep you alive. She was waiting until you found me." Tears burned Odette's eyes. A lifetime of beatings, a lifetime of being the null, the runt, the worthless waste of flesh. The moon had been a silent witness to Odette's shame for years. She had spent 1,000 nights begging for the shift, but the wolf within remained dead. To the Ironwood pack she was a cosmic joke, a queen in rags. "I do not know how to be what you need," she whispered. A single tear tracked through the soot on her bruised cheek. Alaric caught the salt and moisture on his thumb before it could fall. "You do not need to know how," he countered. "You only need to exist. I will teach you the rest." Then he vowed to burn the world to ash to reclaim what was stolen from her. The king turned to his commander with lethal focus. "Silas, find provisions and garments worthy of a monarch. We will not march to war in the rags of the veins." Ethelgard began to stir from its long, icy sleep. Silas, Cale, and the tracker named Thorn moved through the corridors with terrifying precision. They unearthed ancient caches of salted meats and heavy wool cloaks sealed in cedar. In a private chamber, Odette finally shed her humiliation. She discarded the moth-eaten velvet gown Cecilia had used to mock her. She scrubbed the copper scent of dried blood from her skin. The woman in the cracked mirror was a stranger. She was draped in black wool and thick, dark fur. A silver Valerius crest was pinned to her chest. She no longer looked like a scullery maid. She looked like a warrior. The bruise from Gideon Vane remained a purple shadow on her skin. But the terror in her violet eyes had been replaced by a cold, burning realization. She was House Crescentia. She was not a slave. Alaric was waiting for her in the grand hall. He had shed his heavy plate for dark leathers and a loose linen shirt. The fabric strained against the massive corded muscles of his chest. His predatory gaze dragged over her, tracing every line of her new strength. A low, vibrating purr echoed from his throat. It was a sound that demanded submission and promised absolute protection. "It is time to go home, little bird," Alaric said. He tossed a heavy fur cloak over his shoulders. "The wasting moor awaits. We will show Gideon Vane what he has truly awakened." The descent from the heights of Ethelgard was a grueling trial, yet the very atmosphere of the north had changed. The suffocating magic that had petrified the land was finally snapping. As the king marched, the frozen earth softened under his heavy tread. The petrified trees ceased their agonizing wailing and fell into a deep repose. Odette rode a massive midnight black warhorse recovered from the lower stables. Alaric walked at her side. His long strides easily matched the horse's gait. He was a creature of immense stamina, a true apex predator, indifferent to the biting wind. But Odette could feel the coiled tension vibrating within him. His golden eyes scanned the horizon without rest. His nostrils flared as he tasted the bitter wind. He was starving. A century of magical sleep had drained his Lycan reserves to nothing. His beast was clawing at the surface of his skin. It was demanding blood. It was demanding violence. Silas reported. He dropped back from his scouting position. Alaric's jaw tightened. The faded scar on his cheek pulled taut. He looked at Odette. His expression turned cold and merciless. Odette's fingers gripped the leather reins. She remembered Kaelin's laughter as he locked the carriage. She felt the ghost of Gideon's backhand. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed in her chest. It wasn't the void she was used to. It was a heartbeat. A second, deeper pulse throbbed against her own. Traitor. The word echoed in her mind. It was a feral, instinctual thought. A flash of bared teeth followed. Odette gasped. She pressed a hand to her temple. "Are you unwell?" Alaric was instantly at her side. His hand rested on her thigh. The heat of his touch grounded her. "I felt something," Odette whispered. Her violet eyes went wide. "Anger. But it wasn't mine. It felt wild." A fierce, triumphant smile broke across Alaric's rugged face. "She is waking up. Your wolf smells the blood of her enemies. Let her feel it, Odette. Do not push her down." He turned away. He faced the dark tree line of the ironwood border. "Silas, keep her safe. Do not intervene unless she is threatened." Before Odette could speak, Alaric walked forward. The horrifying, beautiful transformation took hold of him. It wasn't the jagged, bone-breaking shift of modern wolves. It was fluid. It was shadow melting into shadow. His heavy boots tore apart. Massive clawed paws hit the earth. His spine elongated. His muscles expanded exponentially, shredding his linen shirt. Dark fur erupted across his skin. Within seconds, the man was gone. In his place stood a monster from the darkest legends. Alaric, in his Lycan form, was a nightmare of muscle and midnight fur. He stood 9 feet tall on his hind legs. His eyes burned like twin suns in the gloom. He let out a roar that shook the snow from the pines. It was a sound of pure dominance. It demanded that every living thing bow or perish. Odette's horse whinnied in terror. Silas held the bridle firm. Odette was trembling, but not from fear. The second heartbeat in her chest was hammering a frantic rhythm. Her vision swam. The edges turned a sharp, hyper-focused silver. She could smell pine needles miles away. She heard the racing of human hearts in the distant camp. Alaric dropped to all fours. He launched himself toward the trees. He moved faster than the eye could track. He was a blur of violence. In the ironwood camp, Kaelin the huntsman warmed his hands. He laughed with the border guards, he sneered. A younger guard looked nervous. Kaelin spat into the fire. A massive shadow fell over the camp. It eclipsed the weak winter sun. Kaelin never reached his blade. The black lichen struck the earth with the violence of a collapsing mountain. The impact didn't just move air, it shattered the permafrost, hurling men and burning timber into the freezing sky like debris. Chaos followed. The ironwood guards shifted, their timber wolf frames appearing in shades of ash and earth. But beside this ancient monarch, they were nothing more than starving curs. Alaric was a force of erasure. One sweep of a massive clawed hand sent 2 wolves through the trunks of ancient pines, their spines splintering with a sound like dry kindling. A third vanished into his maw. The forest, once silent, filled with the wet crunch of bone. Kaelin saw the end coming. He retreated through the gore, reaching for a heavy crossbow on the supply cart. He chambered a bolt tipped in lethal silver. He aimed at the nightmare tearing through his ranks, but a shadow at the forest's edge froze his finger on the trigger. A black warhorse emerged, flanked by steel-clad ghosts from another age. There sat Odette. The peckless runt was gone. In her place sat a figure draped in royal pelts, her violet eyes burning with a light that felt like a physical weight. Kalin's hands began to betray him. She was supposed to be a corpse. Instead, she looked like a god. Survival overrode reason. Kalin swung the silver-laden weapon toward Odette's chest and loosed the bolt. Silas roared, lunging through the snow, but he was a world away. The silver streak cut through the air. In that heartbeat, time died. It slowed to a glacial crawl, dragging every witness into the moment of Odette's extinction. Inside her, the scullery maid wanted to flinch, but the spirit that had survived 20 years of ash and silence finally broke its leash. A voice, ancient and starving, snarled a single word in her mind. Mine. This was no longer a request. It was a decree. Odette did not shift. She didn't have to. She extended a hand, and the air itself seemed to ignite. Luminescent, silver magic tore from her palm. This wasn't the trick of a hedge witch. It was the raw, kinetic sovereignty of House Crescentia. The light consumed the bolt. The wooden shaft turned to vapor mid-flight. The silver tip, once a death sentence, fell into the snow as a harmless piece of metal 10 feet away. Silence reclaimed the clearing. Alaric paused, his muzzle slick with the lifeblood of his enemies. He looked at Odette with a feral, terrifying pride. Kalin collapsed. The weight of her aura was suffocating. A psychic pressure that demanded the knees of every living thing hit the dirt. Ironwood had forgotten this feeling. They had forgotten what real power looked like. "The Crescent," Kalin whispered, his voice a jagged ruin. Gideon Vane hadn't discarded a slave. He had unearthed a deity and given the Wolf King his crown. Alaric moved. He towered over the broken huntsman, then glanced back at Odette. His golden eyes held a silent, lethal question. He was the sword. She was the hand. Odette stared down at the man who had once dragged her by her hair. The girl who knew mercy had died in the silver fire. "Execute him," she commanded. Her voice was ice. It was the tone of a true queen. Alaric's jaws ended the matter. As Kalin's body hit the snow, the king shifted. He stood tall in the biting wind, human once more, and entirely unashamed. He wiped the copper-scented blood from his chin. He walked toward Odette's horse with the heavy, calculated grace of a predator. Looking up, the pharaoh madness in his eyes had settled into a terrifying, singular devotion. Alaric murmured. He pressed his stained forehead against her knee in a silent vow. The journey south bore no resemblance to Odette's previous nightmare in a carriage. It was the winter of 1244. The biting winds seemed to recoil as they passed, bowing to the ancient magic radiating from the king and his queen. News of the Black Keep's sudden thaw raced through the territories like a ground fire. As Alaric, Odette, and the 3 guards marched, they did not stay a small party for long. Gideon Vane had ruled through humiliation, and humiliation breeds a thirst for revenge. Lord William Harrington of the River Run Pack was the first to answer the call. His own aunt, Beatrice, had been frozen as a tribute decades prior. He caught the scent of true sovereignty on the wind and rode out with 50 warriors. They expected to hunt a monster. Instead, Harrington found the mutilated remains of Kalin. Beside the corpse stood a king of legends and a girl radiating the silver light of a crescent moon. Harrington dropped to his knees in the snow. 50 men followed his lead, baring their necks in total submission. The rebellion had its first soldiers. That night they camped mere miles from the Ironwood borders. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and roasting venison. Odette sat upon a fallen oak, her mind spinning as she watched the flames. The second heartbeat in her chest was no longer a frantic flutter. It was a steady, rhythmic war drum. Alaric approached, his massive silhouette casting a protective shadow over her. He had changed into a heavy leather gambeson gifted by Harrington. Still, he moved with the restless energy of a beast barely held by a leash. He sat beside her. The heat radiating from his body seeped into her chilled bones. Alaric noted. His golden eyes tracked the firelight reflecting in her violet gaze. Odette confessed. Her voice was a ghost of a whisper. For 20 years, the world told her she was a null, a scapegoat, a void. Alaric reached out. His calloused fingers traced her jaw, tilting her face toward his. His touch was an anchor. He rumbled, his voice softening into a possessive purr. _quote_47__. Alaric explained that Thorn had investigated the slave camps, the lye Odette used to scrub the cauldrons, the ash she slept in. Every bit of it was laced with wolfsbane and silverleaf. Gideon knew exactly who she was. He had spent 2 decades systematically poisoning her wolf to keep the Crescentia bloodline dormant. A cold shock struck Odette, followed instantly by a white-hot, suffocating fury. This was not a defect of birth. This was calculated, agonizing torture. Gideon had stolen her life, one day at a time. __quote_48__. Alaric continued. He leaned in until his forehead rested against hers. The scent of ozone and sharp pine flooded her senses, calming the beast within. __quote_49__. He had waded through the blood of usurpers and broken the backs of entire legions. Fear was a language he no longer spoke. Quote 50. In that breath, the mate bond struck like a hammer. It was not a mere physical pull. It was an ancient, predatory recognition. 2 souls, once jagged and alone, merged into a singular lethal weapon. Odette leaned into his strength, raw silver magic dancing across her knuckles. She whispered. Alaric offered a kiss that tasted of devotion and iron. He promised. Inside the keep, the air was thick with a stench of spiced wine and unearned victory. Elfer Gideon Vane sat upon his carved throne, clutching a goblet like a lifeline. He laughed, but his eyes were frantic. The winter outside was a screaming beast, yet the Black Keep remained untouched. He believed he had outsmarted a god. The centennial tribute was over, and he had survived the cost. In the center of the hall, his daughter Cecilia spun in imported silks. She was a flash of vanity against the rough wool of a starving pack. Gideon bellowed to his terrified subjects. The hall shook with a sound of cruel, desperate laughter. Then, reality tore open. Boom. It was not a sound, but a concussive weight. The atmospheric pressure shifted, crushing the air from every lung in the room. The massive, iron-bound oak doors did not simply open. They disintegrated. Shards of ancient wood became lethal projectiles raining down upon the revelers. The laughter turned to a choked silence. The half-fires hissed, their orange warmth dying into a violent, unnatural silver blue. 3 giants emerged from the white void of the storm. Silas, Cale, and Thorn stepped over the wreckage. Their broadswords hummed with a runic magic the North had forgotten. Behind them, Lord Harrington led 50 warriors from Riverrun. They fanned out with surgical precision, sealing every exit. Gideon Vane dropped his goblet. Ruby wine bled across the stone floor, dark and prophetic. King Alaric Valerius walked into the light. This was no nursery rhyme myth. This was the god of war made of flesh and fury. His golden eyes burned with a century of silent, agonizing wrath. His Lycan aura was a physical weight, forcing the Ironwood wolves to their knees. They clutched their throats, gasping for air that felt like liquid lead. The room smelled of ozone, split pine, and certain death. Then came the moment that defied history. The ancient monarch did not take the throne. He stopped. He bowed his head. And then he stepped aside. Out of the shadows of the blizzard walked Odette. A sharp, unified intake of breath echoed of the cold stone. The soot-stained scullery maid was gone. In her place stood a vision draped in the midnight furs of the Valyrius king. Silver thread shimmered beneath the weight of the heavy pelts. But the finery was a mere backdrop to the aura that now bled from her skin. An ethereal, blinding silver light radiated outward. On her collarbone, the Clausentia scar, once mocked as a curse, pulsed like a captured star. It illuminated the entire grand hall. Cecilia shrieked. She stumbled back, tangling her legs in the expensive silks of her own vanity. She cried that it was an illusion, a trick of the light, but the truth was undeniable. __quote _57 __. Her voice held a terrifying duality. It was the calm of a woman and the ancient snarl of a predator. Every wolf in the room felt that sound vibrate in their marrow. She had returned to collect every debt. The blood drained from Gideon's face. Logic vanished, replaced by primal panic. He reached into his cloak and pulled out an amulet of jagged, dark bone. This was the stolen relic of Agatha the Witch. For 20 years it had bound the land and silenced Odette's power. "Treason!" the false Alpha shrieked. His voice cracked with desperation. He ordered his men to slaughter the runt. 12 Ironwood guards lunged forward with a unified battle cry. They were slaves to the Vane bloodline. Alaric ignored his sword. A low, deafening roar tore from his throat. His broad shoulders expanded. The sickening crack of shifting bones signaled his intent. He was ready to paint the floor with their blood. Odette stepped in front of him. She raised a single glowing hand. "Mine," her wolf hissed within her mind. It was a command for absolute obedience. Odette did not suffer through the bone-breaking agony of a lesser wolf's shift. She simply exploded into light. Where the woman stood, a towering white direwolf now materialized. Her fur was spun moonlight. Her violet eyes burned with raw, devastating magic. She was a matriarch of the sovereign bloodlines. Her paws struck the stone floor. A shockwave of silver energy blasted through the hall. The charging guards were thrown like broken dolls. Their steel clattered uselessly as they hit the oak tables. Odette did not wait. She moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics. She cleared the distance to the dais in a single bound. Gideon thrust the bone amulet forward, screaming a frantic spell. It was useless against an awakened sovereign. The silver light from Odette's jaws hit the relic. The bone turned a violent red and vaporized into fine ash. Gideon's palm blistered, but his scream was cut short. Odette tackled him. She pinned the false Alpha to his own throne. The sheer weight of the direwolf began to crush his chest. Her ivory canines remained a heartbeat away from his throat, the heat of her breath a final warning. In that hall, the Ironwood hierarchy dissolved into nothing. Every soldier, every noble, and every servant collapsed, their bellies meeting the frozen stone. Within them, the wolves recognized a predator that defied their understanding. They pressed their muzzles into the floor in an ancient biological surrender. The true queen had claimed her seat. Alaric, maintaining his human form, moved through the sea of broken pride. He stepped past Cecilia, a sobbing, irrelevant shadow, without a sideways glance. His focus was a singular, golden beam directed at the massive white wolf holding the usurper captive. Odette stared into Gideon's eyes. This was the man who had measured his worth by the bruises he left for a shattered plate. He was the one who had poisoned her life with wolfsbane and ash. He had discarded her in the winter's teeth to die. Her jaw tightened with a pressure that could have crushed his skull. But she understood the difference between a butcher and a monarch. A quick death was a gift he had not earned. Odette shifted. The blinding radiance of her form collapsed inward. She emerged standing tall, the royal furs of House Crescentia draping over her shoulders as if woven by destiny. She looked down at the husk of a man cradling his scorched hand. She said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Gideon let out a strangled gasp as his internal fire died. His alpha spark was snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. He was, now and forever, A0 _ quote _ 62 _ Odette continued, her gaze devoid of pity. _ quote _ 63 _ quote _ 64 _ Cecilia wailed, dragging herself toward the dais. _ quote _ 65 _ Odette did not look at her. She left them in their wreckage and faced the kneeling pack. Lord Harrington and the Riverrun warriors remained motionless, their allegiance forged in this moment. Alaric ascended the dais, his large, scarred hand finding hers. As their fingers locked, the golden fire of a king met the violet storm of a queen. It was an ancient pact renewed before the eyes of the living. He raised their joined hands toward the rafters. Quote 67. Alaric's voice thundered, shaking the foundations of the keep. _ quote _ 68 _ The roar that followed from the guards and the liberated pack was a physical force. It shattered the last of the stained glass in the high windows. Odette squeezed Alaric's hand, the suffocating weight of her past finally evaporating. She was no longer the peckless runt. She was no longer a null. She was a survivor. She was the mate. She was the queen. Her dominion had just been sealed. The winter of 1244. Once a season promised to tragedy. Now it marked the dawn of a golden era. King Alaric and Queen Odette did not govern with a false alpha's cruelty. Their rule was the fierce, protective justice of ancient lichens. Ethelgard's black keep stood abandoned, a stark monument to a forgotten past. The royal court, meanwhile, flourished within Ironwood's reclaimed heart. Gideon and Cecilia faded into obscurity. Their past cruelties were repaid. They performed the very labor they had once forced upon the innocent. Odette, the peckless runt, once cast aside to perish. She now taught the northern territories a profound truth. True power resided not in a blood tithe. It lived in the unbreakable spirit of a wolf. A spirit that refused to remain dormant. The ancient curse shattered, not by the sacrifice of a royal maiden, but by the awakening of a true queen.